Next on Energy Switch, we'll hear about some surprising trends from two climate experts.
When you hear rhetoric talking about climate change as an existential threat, the first thing to understand is that doesn't square with where the science is at. At the same time, we can hold these two thoughts in our mind. It's a hard slog. We need more options on the table. More options for energy consumption, more options for energy production.
We've already, fortunately, gotten ourselves off of the worst case scenarios. When things just become gloom and doom and people are worried this existential crisis or just the human race faced extinction from these out of control whirlwind scenarios, you almost lose agency.
Coming up on Energy Switch, the good news about climate change. I'm Scott Tinker, and I'm an energy scientist. I work in the field, lead research, speak around the world, write articles, and make films about energy. This show brings together leading experts on vital topics in energy and climate. They may have different perspectives, but my goal is to learn and illuminate and bring diverging views together towards solutions. Welcome to the Energy Switch. We've heard plenty of bad news about climate change, so it may surprise you to hear from our guests that there's now some good news. Emissions growth is slowing and may soon plateau. Many climate scientists now agree that global temperatures are in the lowest window of the UN's future warming scenarios. Over the last century, we're learning to adapt to extreme weather events, reminding us that humans are good at adaptation. We'll talk about these and other positive trends with Dr. Daniel Cohen, who is a climate scientist specializing in atmospheric models. He's an associate professor at Rice University, on the EPA's Board of Scientific Counselors, and author of the book Confronting Climate Gridlock. Dr. Roger Pielke Jr. is a professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado, author of 2 books on climate change, and formerly a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. They'll join me on this eye-opening episode of Energy Switch, the good news about climate change.
We'll get right into it. The IPCC report, most recent one, kind of shows less warming than previously projected. Why is that?
Right, so it's not so much that the science has changed, it's that our emissions trajectory has changed. We're seeing coal use start to plateau and renewable use accelerate faster than was thought before as they've become cheaper than was previously anticipated. And so that's put us on a path now where emissions are trending to a point as we look decades ahead where we're probably going to see them peak and start coming down sooner than might have been thought before. Not fast enough to meet Paris Agreement goals, but not some of the worst case scenarios that was thought a decade or so ago.
Interesting. You see similar things?
Yeah, I do. Our view of the trajectory of future emissions has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Yeah. Whereas we once thought the curve was going to look like this, up, up, and away, now we're looking at a long plateau. Still not Paris Agreement targets, but I think the news is even better than Dan suggested.
So CO2 emissions are falling where?
The United States has been falling since a peak that came around 2006 or so. European Union has been bringing its emissions down, Japan. Right. So most of the wealthiest countries have been reducing their emissions, and it's been offset by emissions growing in the fastest growing parts of the world. And so it's left the world with a very slowly growing emissions that haven't quite reached a peak yet, but are getting close.
We mentioned countries on track to meet climate pledges. There have been lots of different pledges going on. How's the pledge world going?
The Glasgow meeting from 2021 saw a real ratcheting up of commitments. One of the things that we've seen is this dampening down of expectations for growth in emissions based not only on pledges, but what's actually happening in the real world. So I think we can have some optimism that maybe the most aggressive pledges may not be met, but certainly we're headed in a direction that, if we could get in a time machine and go 20 years ago, we'd be more optimistic than probably we were back then.
How do we distinguish sort of, let's call it plausible scenarios? How do you start to distinguish those plausible from implausible?
The IPCC, in order to really do its work and for the scientific community to project long-term futures, needs scenarios of how the economy is going to develop, what energy systems we're going to use, how much we're going to emit, what the economy is going to look like, what global population is. And the IPCC is using scenarios that were developed in 2005 and earlier. And these are getting pretty dated. And so one question we might ask is, well, which ones of those still survive today? So we've done a lot of research trying to quantify that question.